My previous two videos in the Byzantine Emperor series took a look at Leo V and Michael the Slav. Today I'd like to take a look at someone who was a prominent player in both of those previous emperors' lives, and that is none other than Michael II the Amorian. Michael came to the throne in 820 in what can only be described as one of the most chaotic coups in all of history, and then he died in 829 with a hell of a lot of chaos and turmoil in the middle. So today I'd like to take a deeper look at Michael's life as a whole, and in particular at his reign. I will not be covering the Revolt of Thomas the Slav in any degree of detail here, simply because I've already done that in my video on Thomas the Slav. So if you'd like to learn more about that episode, which took up about a third of Michael's reign, I suggest that you watch the video dedicated solely to Thomas the Slav. So now for more Michael. The future Emperor Michael II was born in 770 CE in the city of Amorium in Phrygia, and it is that city of Amorium which gave Michael his name, Michael the Amorian, and also lended the name Amorian dynasty to his family once they had seized the throne. His family were theme soldiers who had served in the army in exchange for the rights to work a plot of land, so they were of lower or possibly middling status. I don't think they were at the bottom of the totem pole by any stretch of the imagination, but they certainly weren't aristocratic. Michael and his family also belonged to an obscure religious group called the Athenganoi sect, and so far as we can tell, based on the biased sources, this was a group which combined some Jewish rituals with Christian beliefs. Which ones it employed or didn't, I couldn't tell you. Michael, due to his relatively humble origins, was poorly educated, and he would later have a reputation for being boorish. He is also known as Michael the Stammerer and as Michael the Phrygian, but the typical usage is Michael the Amorian, and that's what we're going to stick with in this video. As someone who lacked aristocratic heritage, Michael's career was not fast-tracked, and his first great patron was Bardanes Turcus, the guy who launched a usurpation against Nicephorus I in 803. While under Bardanes, Michael served alongside of Leo the Armenian and Thomas the Slav, both of whom were about the same age as him and also became major historical players. Michael was relatively close with Bardanes and married his daughter Thecla, and presumably that was kind of what got him in the door as being someone who was respected and looked upon as a social equal or close enough to being an equal to be taken seriously. Michael and Leo ended up joining Nicephorus after Bardanes revolted, so their loyalty only ran so deep, or maybe they just simply had enough military sense to look at the situation and know that, Bardanes wasn't going places. At any rate, it looks like possibly the famous rift between Michael and Thomas came because of their varying choices during this time. We do know, however, that they had a common friend in Leo, and both of them remained close with Leo for a number of years. However, Michael and Thomas had some serious beef that we don't really fully understand, and that will become important later for reasons you most likely already know. Now, later on, Michael was, of course, key to Leo's overthrow of Michael I Rangabi in 813, and he was so trusted by Leo that he was put in charge of the excubators, the imperial bodyguard, in 813. So at this point, 813, Michael has risen pretty high. He's about 43 years old, and he is one of the right-hand men of the new Emperor Leo V. So life is treating him pretty well. So far as we can tell, Michael and Leo remained close friends from 813 until 820. But then in 820, for reasons that are not entirely clear, Michael soured on Leo and began to slander him in public. Most likely, Michael had conceived an ambition to become emperor and was trying to build up public support for his endeavor. At any rate, Leo wanted to keep this quiet and wanted to get Michael back on his side, so he sent his trusted official John Hexabolus to talk sense to him. However, John was unsuccessful, most likely because Michael was spreading the slander in order to build up support for his coming coup. Coincidentally, John Hexabolus is the same guy who once helped Leo attempt and fail to assassinate the Bulgar Khan early in Leo's reign. At any rate, on Christmas Eve of 820, Hexabolus managed to detect a coup led by Michael, and this led Leo to condemn Michael to death. However, because Leo needed clean hands to perform the Christmas sacraments the next day, he had no choice but to leave Michael imprisoned and delay the execution until after Christmas. So, on the night of Christmas Eve, Michael was in a jail cell in the palace, and Leo was coming up with elaborate ways to have his old friend and the now a traitor executed. And if the sources are to be believed, then it appears that Leo's plan was something right out of an Austin Powers movie. He wanted to have Michael chained to an ape and thrown into the furnaces that were heating the baths of the palace. And presumably, once the ape had to deal with hot coal, he would go crazy and tear Michael limb for limb. I guess that's the plan. At any rate, pretty elaborate, fairly interesting, and this very well could have been the end of Michael had Leo been just a little bit more aware of the extent of the danger facing him. Whatever else we may say here about Michael, I think that it's safe to say that he is someone who clearly could inspire some degree of loyalty, since after he was arrested and while he was still in jail and incommunicado, his followers managed to act on their own accord and put him on the throne. So what happened is that his followers gathered together, they dressed themselves up as choir members, and then they infiltrated the Hagia Sophia. They slowly worked their way up to the altar, and while Leo V was doing some sacraments, they approached him and then drew their daggers and cut him down right in front of the public. On Christmas Day, no less. Then, the conspirators freed Michael and had him crowned by the Patriarch, who may or may not have been involved with the coup. And something that was a little bit less than tasteful for Byzantine aristocrats would be that Michael was still chained. Some of his chains were still attached and they had to be dragged along while he was being sworn in, because no one could find one of the keys that they needed to remove this chain. So, not the most auspicious start, but hey, I guess the coup technically did succeed, even though it nearly ended up with the beneficiary of the coup being thrown under a furnace with an ape. So, hey, I guess results are the most important thing. Perhaps it's appropriate that when Michael was sworn in to be emperor, he was wearing chains that no one could figure out how to remove, since that's kind of how he would rule. If you think about it, ruling without a clearly established sense of legitimacy is like ruling with a handicap, like having a chain or a weight attached. And it looks like his brazen seizure of power and then the undignified optics of the whole thing, being imprisoned, being sworn in with chains, killing someone on Christmas Day in a church on the altar, all of these things really damaged his reputation, and no one could take him seriously as a moral or upstanding citizen after this point. The other thing is, in general, when you have a ruler who doesn't have a very strongly established sense of legitimacy, this means that other aristocrats and other high-ranking generals will look at this person as being vulnerable and as being someone they could pick off and advance their own imperial claims against. Of course, the biggest challenge facing all usurpers, from Michael II to all the rest throughout pretty much all history, and especially in Roman and Byzantine history, the big challenge is establishing that sense of legitimacy during and after the revolt and coup. And I guess we could say that because Michael succeeded in passing on the throne to his son, that he ultimately managed to clear that hurdle. But as we'll see, this was the defining challenge of his entire reign once he was on the throne. Within a few days of Michael seizing power, news arrived in the east, and Thomas the Slav decided to throw his hat into the ring and revolt, taking up the cause of Leo V, his old friend. We won't go into detail here since I've already made a whole video about Thomas's revolt. However, there are a couple things that are worth noting. One is that Michael II was definitely weaker than Thomas during this period of revolt, up until the time of Omertag's intervention. This is because Thomas controlled the eastern provinces, which had the majority of Byzantium's wealth and manpower, whereas Michael was limited to the Balkans, Constantinople, and the Aegean Sea. Michael ultimately was able to put an end to Thomas's revolt and restore full control of the empire by the spring of 824, and in one of his greatest achievements, he was able to reintegrate all of the former rebels into the empire, and presumably most of them did not revolt again, so that's actually a fairly decent achievement. So what was the cost of Thomas's revolt when all was said and done in the spring of 824? Most likely, the cost was that now Byzantium as a whole was weaker, and in particular, it was weaker in terms of its navy. So, most scholars agree that Thomas's revolt did a great deal of damage to the empire and helped to really fuel the military disasters during Michael's last years. And the main problem of Thomas's revolt in the long run is that in order to defend his throne, Michael II had to repulse Thomas's fleets. And the way that he did that was with Greek fire. So Thomas threw 2 fleets at Constantinople, and both of them were heavily defeated, which means that Byzantium might have lost something in the neighborhood of like half or 2/3 of its navy. And then it only had a couple years to recover and repair before Arab attacks began. So that's definitely not great. However, in addition to the naval losses incurred in this civil war, there also were other issues at play, and these were not strictly speaking Michael II's fault. And the major problem was that the last several emperors had mostly neglected the fleet, since there hadn't been a major Arab threat to Constantinople in several decades. So, the fleet itself was not nearly as large or well-trained or prepared as it should have been, and that really was something that would come back to haunt Michael. Before we look at the specific things that went wrong late in Michael's reign, I think that it's worthwhile to look at some general trends in the Arab world. And the biggest trend that really made itself felt at this time was the decentralization of the Abbasid Caliphate. So, in theory, the Abbasid Caliphate was still the strongest power in the world. But, in practice, they had lost a lot of control over their peripheral areas. So, for instance, the Caliph in Baghdad had effectively no control over North Africa. Umayyad Spain had broken away in the 750s following the Abbasid Revolution, so that was acknowledged as gone, but other areas were equally as gone, even if it had not been officially acknowledged yet. So, what happens is that a lot of these outlying areas will sense weakness and opportunity at the expense of the Byzantine Empire, and we'll see that some renegade Islamic forces will pounce on the outlying areas of Byzantium. Ostensibly, the Abbasids were still nominally in charge of nearly all of the hostile powers that we'll see emerge, but in practice, not so much. Baghdad was not directing these operations by any stretch of the imagination, and if you do read that in a source, it is merely either a misunderstanding or some sort of rhetorical flourish to build up this idea of Muslim versus Christian and some sort of larger, more meaningful conflict. The first area to be taken over by opportunistic Islamic forces was the island of Crete. What happened here is that there were a group of political exiles, some 10,000 strong, who had left Al-Andalus after taking part in a failed revolt. These exiles had resettled in North Africa for about a decade and practiced piracy, and then at some point between 824 and 827, these exiles had then invaded and conquered Crete. So Michael responded fairly early by sending reinforcements, and those reinforcements may have stood a chance, but then other invasions happened in Sicily, and Michael decided to divert his attention there since Sicily is a much more prosperous and important province. The Emirate of Crete was established starting in Michael's time and going all the way until 961, when Michael's distant successors eventually recaptured the island in the name of the Byzantine Empire. Over in Sicily, things were actually a little bit more Byzantine, if you'll forgive my use of the word. So there was an admiral of the fleet in Sicily named Euphemius, and for whatever reason he decided to force a nun to break her vows and marry him. When Michael II heard of this, he ordered his general in the area to remove the admiral from office. However, Euphemius killed the general and then entered into open revolt. In order to keep himself alive and remain married to the nun, Euphemius invited the Abbasid Emirate to invade Sicily from its base in North Africa. The Abbasid Emirate was yet another area which was effectively independent from the Abbasid Caliphate, although I think nominally they were still subjects. At any rate, the Abbasid's invaded. They won a major victory at Mazzaro on July 15, 827, and then they laid siege to Syracuse. However, disease broke out in the Abbasid ranks, and that prevented a total conquest. This would then lead to a long-term stalemate between Byzantine and Arab forces that would rage all the way until 902. But in the longer term, Byzantine and Arab forces would fight each other in Italy, South Italy, and Sicily all the way up until 1091. So this weird little sequence of events here, which was so typical of something that would happen under someone like Michael II, set off a very strange chain of events. And I assume that it was after Mazzaro when Michael II was forced to pull a lot of forces from his expeditions to Crete and send them to Sicily instead. Of course, and unfortunately, no account of any Byzantine emperor would be complete without at least a run-through of their religious policies. Michael II continued Leo V's policy of iconoclasm, but he ended the outright persecution of iconodules, and he slackened the enforcement of iconoclasm. Michael II, in general, tried to steer a middle ground that would keep everyone content, and for the most part, it looks like he succeeded. Aside from some jibes at him by the zealots, he prevented any major problems. Although some people have argued that Thomas's revolt was in part inspired by religious reasons. However, given how early it broke out in Michael's reign, it's very unlikely that it could have possibly been motivated by Michael's own policies. At any rate, Theodore of Studium, the zealot leader, died in 826, and that probably helped to alleviate some of the pressure that Michael may have felt from the zealot faction. At the same time, he remarried after the death of Thecla, and he chose Constantine VI's daughter Euphrosyne as his new wife. And it's pretty obvious why he did that. There was still sort of a legend around Constantine VI, and he would, that would help to offset some of Thomas's appeal, since there are some rumors that Thomas claimed to be Constantine VI and took up that mantle to some degree. So maybe this would give Michael more legitimacy by marrying into the daughter of someone who represented a well-established dynasty from the past. But there was a major problem with Euphrosyne, and that was because she was a nun, so this created a lot of complaints from the ecclesiastical community, but at any rate, he seems to have gotten away with it. Michael's achievements are pretty modest, yet they still need to be reckoned. First of all, he managed to maintain peace with Omertag's Bulgar Khanate and the Abbasid Caliphate under Mamun. And that is actually a significant thing, since both of those were major powers, and a war with either one of them would have been very costly. So, that's bigger than it sounds at first blush. Another thing that he managed to do is, after dealing with Thomas's revolt, he managed to pardon and reintegrate all of Thomas's former followers, and that put an end to any more revolts against him. So that was a pretty big achievement as well, even if, a lot of the problem was created in the first place by how he seized power in a way that ensured he had no legitimacy. But, if you're going to create your own problems, you might as well at least solve them. He also initiated a project to strengthen and heighten the walls of the Golden Horn. Thomas almost seized Constantinople by attacking from the Golden Horn, and Michael understood that this was the weak point, so he tried to strengthen it. His son Theophilus would complete that project. Michael also rewarded his home city of Amorium by enriching it and empowering it, and that would last for a little while. He also did just well enough to allow Byzantine recovery efforts in the Balkans to continue. We don't really know of any major boom that took place under Michael, but certainly there was no bust, so that's definitely something that is worthy of mentioning, even if we can't quite elaborate on it too much. Although Michael was a somewhat interesting man who lived in very interesting times, his legacy was a modest one. He came to power under absolutely absurd circumstances, but he still managed to establish a dynasty with legitimacy. How exactly he did that is anyone's guess, but he did. His son was fully accepted as emperor, his son Theophilus pictured here. At the end of the day, it's hard to conclude that Michael II was anything other than a mere placeholder for his son, his grandson, and the Macedonian dynasty that would come on the scene later.